Faith in end times. That's what we're looking at this morning, thinking about. End times is that time, really, you can call it the last days as well, from the time of Jesus ascending up into heaven until he comes again. And we're thinking about faith, how we trust him this morning. And we'll just really highlight a couple of things at the end of this sermon, or during this sermon, that point towards how we might have a right mindset in these times, the right way of looking at things. But before we get there, to those kind of 2 points, we do just want to try and understand a little bit of what's going on here in this passage in Daniel chapter 8. And we notice that we're looking at a second vision here in chapter 8. So we had one last week. We saw Daniel had one given to him in the first year of Belshazzar. Now he is given one in the third year of Belshazzar. And it's similar to the last one in some ways, and yet it is different as well. So the year that he is given this vision is about the year 550 BC. That's 11 years before Babylon will fall. So remember, in Daniel chapter 6, we were looking at a time period where Babylon had fallen, and the power, the empire of the Medes and Persians had come in under Darius and Cyrus, but now we've gone back in time, back to Belshazzar, who was conquered by the Persians. He's still in control. Babylon is still the superpower, and the children of Israel are still waiting to go back to their homeland. And during this time, Daniel is transported to a place called Shushan in verse 2. We would say Susa today. We have a little map here which shows you where he was kind of transported to by God. So the vision, he was almost certainly in Babylon still, but by God's power, he's given a vision in this city called Susa, which was in the kingdom of Elam at the time. And you can see that that's between the Persians in the south and the Babylonians in the north. Eventually, the Persians will conquer both Elam and Babylon, and they will set up their kind of headquarters, their summer headquarters in that place called Susa. And the story of Esther takes place in that city in the Bible. And we can ask, what does Daniel see in this vision that God gives him in this place in Susa? And really, he sees two kingdoms to begin with. The one is the Medes and Persians that we've just been talking about, and one is the Greek Empire. He sees both of those. They're listed, aren't they, in verse 20 and 21. It says, the ram, which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of the Medes and Persians. So here's a kingdom that it's described as having two horns, and those not only equate to the kingdom of the Medes and Persians, but each horn is equal to one of those two kingdoms. So you might remember the Persians, in a way, took over the Medes. And so this ram has a smaller horn and a larger horn. And the smaller horn represents the Medes, and the larger horn represents the Persians, who were the dominating force within that kingdom. And that's the first one to come on the scene in Daniel's vision. And we'll look a bit more at his behavior in a moment. The second one is verse 21, we see is the kingdom of Greece. So this goat is identified as the kingdom of Greece. It has one large horn, which is the first king of that kingdom, which turns out in history, remember, we're looking back on the fulfillment of this prophecy and this vision. Daniel is looking forward. He's giving details which are strikingly detailed. He's giving facts that are strikingly detailed in terms of this vision. And he describes the goat unusually as having one major horn. And in a contrast to the kingdom of the Medes and Persians, Greece came with one mighty leader. We know him as Alexander the Great. And he headed up the Greek. He was the first real king of the Greek Empire. And we see their behavior, don't we, described to us. And this is the behavior that was carried out historically. So again, Daniel gives us a very accurate description of the way these two kingdoms behaved. So in verse 4, he says, I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. So this is the expansion of the Persian and the Medes and Persian Empire. And they did expand in all those directions. And no animal, no other kingdom could stand in their way. They were powerful, they were mighty. And they were like that for a couple of hundred years until the Greek Empire came on the scene in its full power under Alexander the Great. And so we see him come on the scene in verse 5. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. So he came with great speed, flying, hardly touching the ground. And that's the Greek Empire is famous for conquering everything in its path at a rapid pace, with Alexander the Great at the front, leading the way. And so they've gone down in history. And yet, here in Daniel chapter 8, they're not the main focus of this chapter. They're just the background for the main focus. The main focus is the little horn that we're introduced to in verse 9. He takes up the main part of this. So when we say a little horn, we're not thinking of a horn you blow. We're thinking of a horn like on a rhinoceros or something like that. So it speaks of power. But when it's speaking of evil kings, it's speaking of power raised up against the one mighty God. This is the kind of horn that is in view here. Even though it's described as little, it acts like it's big, and it does bring about big results. So verse 9 we read, and out of one of them, that's out of the four horns that come out of the one horn. So maybe we should go back to verse 8. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in its place four notable ones, that's four other horns, came up toward the four winds of heaven. And this spoke of four other leaders who would divide up the kingdom of Greece. And that's exactly what happened. Greece was split into four parts. When Alexander died at a very surprising age, young age, and he lay on his deathbed, we don't know whether he was poisoned or whether he died of a fever, one of his generals said to him, who should succeed? Who should take over your kingdom? Who do you give it to? And he said, to the best man. And that's what happened. They fought over his kingdom, and four generals carved up his kingdom, one to the north, one to the south, one to the east, one to the west. And out of the kingdom of the north came this little horn. That we're told, aren't we, that it would come out of one of these kingdoms. In history, it came out of the northern kingdom. So it says in verse 9, as we were saying, in its place, four notable horns came up to the four winds of heaven, and out of one of them came a little horn, which grew really great. And this little horn spreads to the south and to the east and towards the glorious land. That's towards Judah. That's towards God's land. And this person we know in history as Antiochus IV Epiphanes. That's who he is. He comes up immediately after these four leaders, and he comes from the northern kingdom. And he ruled as a leader of Greece, as a Greek leader, I should say, from 175 BC to 164 BC. And we know this from history, and here is Daniel describing really in a very accurate way what happens before it happens. And as we said, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, this leader, this little horn, he gets given the kind of prime place in this chapter because even though Alexander the Great might be more famous, this is the king who really turns his attention as a little horn towards God and shakes his fist and wants to destroy God's people, and he wants to take the place of God himself. So we saw, didn't we, in verse 9, that he moves towards the glorious land. That's his expansion. That's towards God's people. And we read in verse 24 of chapter 8, that at the end of verse 24, this is a description of him still. He dominates in this description, in this chapter. And it says, he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. He was a man who wanted to spread the Greek culture so very, very much. And anyone who stood in his way, he would want to put down. And of course, any Jew that held to being faithful to God was going to come under his punishment and persecution. And he also sets himself up as God. He wants to be seen as someone who takes the place as God. And we see this in verses 10 through 12. I'm going to read it to you from the NIV, the Hebrew, which this chapter is written in, as is the rest of the book of Daniel now, is really quite difficult. For the experts, it's quite difficult. And maybe the NIV has maybe captured it in a bit of a clearer way. So just listen, follow it in the NKJV, but listen to it in the NIV. And it says here, it, that's the horn, grew until it reached the host of heavens. And it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. So here we're getting a little glimpse that in wicked days and wicked people, they have behind them spiritual power like Satan himself. And there's a spiritual war going on. And when we get to chapter 10, we'll see that more clearly and we'll pick that up. Verse 11, it, the horn, set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. In other words, he set himself up to be like God. And he took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. So that's speaking of the temple. There were daily sacrifices morning and evening. He stopped those. And he turned the use of the temple away from worship of God to the worship of idols. And he purposely did this. He defiled and dirtied the temple. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. That's to the horn. And it prospered in everything it did. And truth was thrown down to the ground. So we'll look at that hopefully a bit more. But can you see how he attacks God's people and tramples them and sets himself up in the place of God? And for this, he's given special attention by God. God is someone who takes note of all who persecute his church. And all who shake their fist at him, he takes note. And their end will come. So that's a bit of the picture. We could spend so long looking at more of the detail of this picture. We simply haven't got time this morning. If you have questions, then we can talk more about it. But we just want to try and draw two lessons this morning from this passage. And the first lesson is don't do dates. Don't do dates. Now, we're not speaking about romantic interaction or things like that. We're speaking about how you view end times and whether you're searching for a date as to when things will happen and wanting to say, I know this date and I know that date. And the church has done that consistently throughout history to the damage of the church on every occasion. And we see the issue of dates in a way, or at least of asking about what will happen and when, in verses 13 and 14, don't we? So it says, then I heard a holy one, that's an angel, speaking, and another angel said to that certain one who was speaking, how long, see there's the question, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary, the temple and its surroundings, and the host, that's God's people, to be trampled underfoot. In other words, when will it begin and when will it end? That's the question being asked by the angels. And the answer is given. And he said to me, for 2,300 days, or in the Hebrew, for 2,300 mornings, evenings, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Then the 2,300 days will come to an end. Now, notice it isn't a date. It is speaking about a period of time. It is speaking about a time that has a beginning and an end. But can you see God, in his wisdom, is being quite cagey and vague about when these things will start and when they will finish. And God is being purposeful in that. Many people, they look at something like this, a number, and they immediately think, I need to find out when it happened, when it started, when it's going to finish. And they do that with other dates, as we will see, especially what we consider to be the last days, which we're in now. They long to put a date on things. But we can see that God doesn't cater to that desire. He gives us riddles. He gives us symbolic numbers. You know, in this kind of writing, which is apocalyptic writing, which is Daniel, books like Daniel, and parts of Zechariah, and Revelation, we are to assume the numbers we come across are symbolic unless it's so very clear that they're a literal number. And God gives us a symbolic number here. And it has a definite beginning, and it has a definite end. But you know, even though this event has happened in our history, we still are not sure of the beginning and the end of this period of time that Daniel outlines here. Experts in history and scripture can't be certain of when this time started and ended. We can look back from here and we can make a best guess. And the best guess for when this 2,300 days, in quotes, finished is the 14th of January, 164 BC. That's the year and that's the date when the Jewish leader, a man called Judah Maccabees, conquered. He had finished conquering the army of Antiochus IV, and he was now free to cleanse the temple in Jerusalem and begin the sacrifices again. And that's what he did on the 14th of January, 164 BC. And it's still celebrated by the Jews today. It's called Hanukkah. And it's mentioned in the Bible in chapter 10 of John's Gospel. It's called the Feast of Dedication, and Jesus attends the temple on the celebration of that deliverance and the cleansing of the temple. But even knowing that, trying to work back from that date in 164 and say, now we're going to work out when the 2,300 days started, it simply can't be fitted into the history we know if we take it literally. If we demand that we count back those days in one way or another, or we call them days, or the mornings and evenings, which is in the Hebrew, we will get into all sorts of historical contortions. Do you know what it is to contort something? If you're a human contortionist, maybe you can wrap your your leg around your neck, or something like that. And you can do all sorts of crazy things with your body. Well, sometimes people do that with history and dates to try and make symbolic numbers work. So we have to be careful with numbers and figures in the Bible that aren't dates. And this is a reality for all apocalyptic writing. So as I've said, I don't believe God wants his people doing dates from symbolic numbers in the Bible. We have another example. We mentioned it last week in chapter 7, verse 25, where we have a description of a little horn there. It's not the same little horn. That picture, as we were told last week, is the final Antichrist, and we'll mention him shortly. But it speaks that his kind of rule and reign, in all its fullness, is going to be at the end of verse 25 in chapter 7, for a time and times and half a time. And again, you can see God has not chosen to give us numbers that are clearly understood. They are speaking about a period. It does have an ending and a beginning, but it's not clear how we're to understand it. And again, it's best to approach it in a kind of vague way and accept an overall kind of message of waiting and endurance rather than specific dates. So for that one, we have a time and times and half a time. And maybe the best explanation is that a time shows its beginning, and times speaks about a middle that goes on for an indefinite period. Times, it's not 2, it's not 3, it's not 4. We don't know how many times it will go on. And then half a time seems to represent a sudden ending, an unexpected ending. And certainly we will see that God is into unexpected endings when it comes to evil's power and reign. So we are strongly tempted to kind of read dates into this kind of thing and look for recognizable times and lengths. But when we do that, I think we're moving towards us wanting control rather than trusting the God who is in control of the situation. And really, God, in giving us these type of numbers, is calling us to trust him in difficult times and not to look for precise details. So let's think briefly why, a couple other just kind of thoughts about why we don't do dates. And the next heading, if it will click along, I don't know if it will, it appears God doesn't want us knowing detailed dates. And we've said that, haven't we? That seems to be the flow of chapter 7 and chapter 8, that God isn't giving us detailed dates. And you might remember in Deuteronomy 29, it says, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may follow all the words of the Lord. So there's a call, there's a point being made that God does withhold things from us so that we depend on his word and his promise. And did you notice here in this vision, Daniel doesn't know. Look at verse 27. It says, and I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterwards I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. Here is Daniel. He's the wisest man in the whole of Babylon. God has poured wisdom into him. God's given him an interpretation of the vision, but he hasn't given him understanding of the dates. And he doesn't understand how it's all going to work out. And you know what? We recognized, didn't we, that Daniel in one way foreshadows Jesus as a man of wisdom. And it's striking that when Jesus comes on the scene, this is what Jesus says about the end time dates, which is what we all get drawn into. Matthew 24, verse 36. Jesus says, as he speaks about the last days and the times that we all live in and have been living in for centuries, he says, but after that day or hour, about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So there's a mystery there. God the Son, who knows all things in his humanity, as he walks this earth, he speaks and he says, I don't know that date. Just like the man of wisdom in Daniel chapter 8. And that should make us very, very slow to try and think about, it's a call upon us to understand certain dates about the end times. I think when we go down that road, there's a pride in us, and there's a desire for control that just sends us in that direction, and it's not healthy and it's not good. We're warned about that kind of pursuit of knowledge that isn't helpful to the church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, it says this, knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. But whoever loves God is known, but whoever loves God is known by God. And that's a wonderful thing, isn't it? That's a wonderful thing, to be known by God, to pursue a knowledge of God and to be known by him. And he says that there's a place for knowledge, but there's also a limit to our knowledge. I think this is a worthwhile warning for us as a church. The church through history has had a fixation, a fascination with putting dates on when Jesus Christ will come. And yet scripture that talks about the end coming clearly tells us that God knows the appointed time, but we don't, and we're to be satisfied with that. And when people pursue this knowledge of end times and the detail, what historically we've seen is they damage the church. They don't help the church. So we could give countless examples, but one example is a man called Harold Camping. And back in the 90s and 80s, he was an American pastor and radio broadcaster, and he said a lot of good things. He sounded really solid on a lot of things. And then out the blue, one day, he said the world will end, Jesus will come again in 1994. And he took a lot of people with him. And then when he didn't come in 1994, he said it's according to the Jewish calendar, so it will be the first half of 95. And then when that didn't happen, he said God is being merciful to the world like he was to Nineveh in the days of Jonah. And he's withheld his coming. Now, I don't know how you respond to that. You might chuckle, or I don't know, you might think that he's a fool, but he took many people with him and he damaged many people. And there are countless examples that people buy into. Many people, they don't go quite for a specific date, but they say, in my lifetime, all the things are lined up, all the signs are ready. Jesus is going to come in my lifetime. These are the reasons why. And then they have to modify and change it as the very things that they said pointed to Jesus' coming change in world history. And again, the church is damaged. Every prediction by a human about Jesus Christ coming has failed to materialize when they put dates and times on it. That should tell us something. And the Bible here is telling us something. This chapter in Jonah, he's not saying emphasize the here and now, work out the here and now. Look what he's saying to the people. He's saying, very shortly you're going to return from exile. You're going to rejoice. But listen, that's not the end. There's going to be hard times after that. That's what I'm telling you. There's going to be great times of persecution. There's going to be tribulation. There will be deliverance and tribulation. It's not the end of your suffering. Be prepared. I'm telling you now so that you can cope, so that you can be comforted in those times of difficulty. That's the message of chapter 8. Now, of course, the Bible tells us to be ready. Jesus can come anytime. Live a life that is pure. But that's very different. Living a life that is ready in obedience is very different from being preoccupied for some unknown reason. We're trying to work out dates that God in his wisdom has only given us as things to kind of be aware of, to know that there is a beginning, there is a trial, and there is an end. That's the message behind these numbers. You will be delivered, and I know when it is. That applies to all situations that you find yourself in. If you're going through some other trial now, there is a beginning. There are trials. There will be an end. That's what God is promising. So we're called to endure, and we're called to be comforted by these things. You know, our second point under the first heading is that knowing dates doesn't achieve what we think it does. I don't know what you think you will achieve if you're someone who desires to know dates. What do you think you'll achieve? What are you hoping to get from that? If you knew, what would it do for you? Would it bring you peace? Would it bring you joy that you think you would get from that? Would it bring you holiness? All of those things come from trusting in God without knowing. That's where they come from. And knowing a date does nothing to add to that. If anything, it takes away. So in 1 Thessalonians, Paul has to warn the church that they were becoming lazy because they thought they knew that Jesus was coming back very, very soon. And they became lazy and they weren't working. People in the time of Harold Camping, one guy said, well, listen, my wife and I are in desperate trouble in our marriage, but now I'm not bothering because Jesus is coming in 3 months. These are it seems to produce unholy responses to feel we know when God has called us to endure and trust him. That's where our great hope is. And we cry out, how long? You know, right now, I'm crying out, how long? I have an office just up here with a window out onto the church, and it's a racket every day and has been for months and months and months. They're building, there's beeping, there's every day the big forklift is reversing 20, 30, 40 times and beeping, beeping, beeping. There's clanging girders. Now they're digging up the road, and I don't know how far they're going to go. They dug it up, and now they're digging it up again. And maybe they'll dig it up another time. And I look at that building over there, and I read on the side of the notices, and it says, open 2018 September. And I'm going, you're joking, aren't you? And so I go and ask the builders, well, when is this opening? It says here 2018. I said, I can't believe that's going to open. He said, oh, this column here is opening in 2018. This one and this one, 2019, 2020. Ah, that makes a bit more sense. Have you told the students moving in here that this is happening here and here? No, we haven't mentioned that to them at the moment. But does it help me knowing? Is knowing that there's that? No, I'm crying out that I will know God in the noise, that God will come to me now in the crisis, that he will sustain me while the noise is going on. The date doesn't actually help me. Jesus helps me now. In the very trial, I need him. But if I'm so fixated with working it out, then my mind and heart isn't pursuing the one who stands in the trial with me. In all the noise and in all the clanging. So don't do dates. I believe that's the message of the Bible. And I believe it's a very, very helpful message for us who are in the last days. Jesus could return today. And suddenly we would see the picture as he sees it. Or he might return in 1,000 years. That's not our business. Our business is to be ready for him with obedience and purity and holiness, and to endure. Secondly, and we'll try and make this one quite quick. Keep going through, there you go. And it'll be, there will always be antichrists until the final one. That's just our second point. There will always be antichrists until the final one. We've described an antichrist, hasn't we? Someone who is totally against God's people and totally against God. In the New Testament, the antichrist is described as someone who denies Jesus Christ and who he is and what he has done. And just as we can be preoccupied sometimes with knowing dates, the church can get preoccupied with trying to work out who the Antichrist is, when he will come. Maybe he's here right now. Maybe that is him or that is her or whatever. Certainly there will be an Antichrist. John makes that clear in 1 John chapter 2. Let's just read that. Dear children, this is the last hour. Think about that. Look at that. This is the last hour. Is he being literal? No, he's talking about a period of time. It's been 1900 years, that last hour. And it carries on. This is the last hour. We're to live like it's the last hour. And as you have heard, that the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour. So the last days are characterized by Antichrists, by people who are against God and oppose God and want to dethrone the name of Christ and stand in his place. Some Antichrists will be well known. Many will live under the radar of history. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was a famous Antichrist. He is a picture of the final one. That's why he's a little horn, like the little horn in chapter 7. The little horn in chapter 7 isn't the same one. He comes out of the fourth kingdom. He comes out after the Roman Empire, out of the 10 horns. He is the final one. There will be a final Antichrist. But Antiochus Epiphanes behaves like one, and when you're under his rule, you feel like he is the one. That's one of the dangers of trying to pinpoint who is who. Epiphanes, that's a nickname given to Antiochus IV. It kind of means God revealed. That's how he saw himself. His coins had image of God written above his image. And he went down in history for wanting to wipe out the Jews and their religion. He was ruthless in imposing Greek culture. He stopped the temple worship in Jerusalem. He stopped the daily sacrifices morning and evening. He turned the temple into a temple worshipping Zeus. And he erected an idol in that temple to Zeus. And he offered pigs on the altar, which was an abomination and a stench and a stink to the Jewish people. And he made them eat the meat from those sacrifices. He banned circumcision, and if he found mothers circumcising their sons, they were killed. He burned the Torah, the Jewish Bible, and tried to stamp it out. And anyone who resisted him and his purge of and his cleansing of anything that wasn't Greek, he would put them to death, or they were in very great danger of being put to death. Now, can you imagine a tribulation and a suffering, a hardship worse than that? We hear about ISIS, but is ISIS any worse than this? Many, many, many Jews died at this time. This is the work of an Antichrist. He hates God's people and wants to destroy them. He hates God and wants to take his place. And Daniel's description, as we saw, of Antiochus fits the description of an Antichrist. We saw it in those verses 10 through 12, didn't we? Where he sets himself up and he deposes people and he tramples over God's people. Listen to the description in 23 through 25. This is a description of Antiochus given before he comes, and it fits the picture of someone in outright rebellion against God. Verse 23, and in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes, wicked schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, against God himself, against Jesus Christ. But he shall be broken without human means. That doesn't mean humans aren't involved. It means that God will bring it about. So Antiochus is an antichrist who points towards the Antichrist. So there is a final Antichrist, but there are many before him. And that's what Jesus said. If we had time, we could look at Jesus where he warns us to watch out for the Christ over there and the Messiah over here. And he warns us that there will be many that claim to be him before he comes again. So two brief lessons then from this second point as we finish. Firstly, don't be fooled. Don't be fooled. Antichrists copy Jesus. Some can do miracles. The final Antichrist will do real signs and wonders. And he will deny Christ and claim to be Christ himself. That's what we read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I would encourage you to read that passage again. But you settle in your heart today, that Jesus has already come once, and when he comes again, every eye will see him on that day. So don't be fooled by the call that there's a Christ here or a Christ there. And I would also say, these are delicate things because there are many, many good Christians who differ on these things. In terms of caring for you, this is a good thing to say. But don't be fooled. Jesus doesn't come to take us out of the tribulation, but to gather us after the tribulation. I think that's an important thing. That's the picture that is given to us here in Daniel chapter 8. It's a picture of an Antichrist, of the end times. Yes, it's already been fulfilled, but it's a foreshadowing. And in it, God's people go through the suffering, right to the very end, right till the final point of deliverance. And we need to be prepared for that as a church. It is unhelpful, I believe, and shaky to think that we will somehow avoid that suffering. That can lead us into a dilemma if we go into it, if that should be our calling. Certainly, this is the teaching of Thessalonians chapter 2. Again, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where Paul makes it, I think, very clear. In 1 Thessalonians, he mentions our being snatched up together to be with Christ, which people call the rapture. And they say that will happen before the tribulation comes. But Paul, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, speaks of that event as the day of Jesus Christ's coming, when he gathers his people to himself. And he says very clearly that before that day happens, the man of lawlessness, that's the Antichrist, must be revealed. And then the end will come. That's important. You know, back in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, there was a great persecution in China called the Boxer Rebellion. And many, many Chinese suffered massively and they were slaughtered. And many of those Christians turned to some of the missionaries and they said, "What is happening? You told us we wouldn't go through the tribulation. Can it be any worse than what we're going through?" And we need to be prepared to suffer for the name of Christ. He knows the times. He knows the dates when he will come. We don't know who the Antichrist will be. And again, we're not told to guess in that regard. We're told to understand the times, and we're told to be ready because Jesus Christ will come like a thief in the night. Finally, don't be fearful. Don't be fearful. The same thing that happened to Antiochus and to Alexander will happen to that final Antichrist. Look at verse 8 of chapter 8. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken. Right at his power, right at his peak, he was broken suddenly. His time came to an end. Turn over to verse 25. And at the end of verse 25, it talks about this little horn. It says, "He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means." Last week we were seeing how he was still speaking words when his end came. It will come suddenly. Listen to a little passage from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. It says this, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming. Do you see that? What a glorious day. What power is suddenly displayed in the one who is waiting for the time he has appointed to come, a time he knows clearly. It's a wonderful day, and what a date it will be, and what a glorious moment it will be. The Antichrist, the deceiver of Satan, will be destroyed. Satan himself will be eternally cast down. His influence and power will be no more. But all who love Jesus Christ's coming will glory in that splendor and brightness of their King and Savior, as Satan is broken by his mere appearance, by his very breath, by his very words. The Antichrist will come to an end, and all who are hoping for his coming will rejoice on that day. So, dear brothers and sisters, we don't need to know dates. We don't need to know who will be the Antichrist. But we do need to know the one who will destroy him at his coming. We need to trust in him now in our present crisis. Amen.